Welcome to the second session, which is titled The European Media Facing the Crisis, Issues, Challenges and Policy Responses. So I think that we all know that media sector is important for the good functioning of our democracies, and not only for that, but for the good functionings of this very strange construct, which is the European multi-level governance structure and models. Today, the European media, not only European media, but especially European media, are facing a crisis that we can say it is attributed to the revenue, but also to the fact that the business model of the media sector is changing, and somehow the European media seems to be a little bit slower to adapt. What we see is that in spite of this, the fact that media are facing a crisis might be bad because they are more exposed to the risk of losing their independence and freedom, which is very important. And especially in time of our COVID crisis, this is important, and I think this is under the eyes of everybody to have a fully functioning European media sector. Why? Because European citizens never more than as in this period, they need professional, secure and functioning media. So this panel will focus on understanding the issues and challenges faced by the media, and in particular by journalists, in discussing short, medium and long-term strategies to support and overcome the crisis. In the chat, I'm going to now give you the list of our panelists, so I hope you can see it. I will not necessarily follow the same order, because I would like, you will see that there is an equilibrium. There are three, let's say, academics in this panel and three practitioners. I will first give the floor to the three practitioners with the following order: Renat from the European Federation of Journalists, Vincent Peyragne from the WANIFRA, the World Association of Newspaper and News Publisher, and then Christophe Leclerc from Fondation Euractiv. And then I will give the floor for thoughts and issues and discussion to Beatriz and Alvaro. And I will indulge myself as a moderator and as an academic if I've got something to communicate. What I wanted to say is that this panel follows very well the what has been said before, and in particular, I'm referring to what Remus said before about this overgrowing complexity in our society, in our world, what Elena Garcia has said before about the need of specialized knowledge as a conditio sine qua non to provide the right policy decisions, and to what Clara Bolintiro said about the necessity of a common political vision to address the crisis. It is not by chances that we invited these Vincent, Christophe and Renat to talk today and to give us their vision of the problems and their policy solutions, because very recently, it is something of the few days, WANIFRA, for example, launched, if you connect to their website, a couple of very nice initiatives. First of all, they've got what they call how newsrooms are coping with the COVID, which is a survey that they've been launching on the different newsroom in Europe and the world. Vincent, correct me if I'm wrong. And then they've got another specialized session, which is called the coronavirus in the newsroom. The European Federation of Journalists has recently launched the call on to EU government to fight the coronavirus crisis. And the Euractiv, the Fondation Euractiv, has recently launched an open letter to the President of the European Commission, which was titled A Coronavirus Plan for the Media. And Christophe, correct me if I'm wrong, I just received, while we were busy with the previous session, a newsletter which was titled How to Sustain Trust in Democracies and Save the Media. It's time to start, and we will start with Renat. Renat is the director of the Europe. I was introducing Renat, I was presenting Renat. Renat is the director of the European Federation of Journalists today. Before, she was part of the International Federation of Journalists. For the European Federation of Journalists, she has been working in several experts groups, including the group on freelancers, broadcasting media literacy, and digital journalism. Renat, the floor is yours. No, the video is yours. If you want to say a few more things about yourself before you start introducing your challenges, issues, and the policy response. Renat, are you there? You can take the video now.
Do you hear me?
Very well, and we see you very well. Welcome, Renat, and thanks for joining. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Luciano. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me and for organizing this very important subject we all care about, I think. I will not say anything about myself, more just 2 words about the European Federation of Journalists. It's the largest journalist organizations. Our members are journalist unions and associations, and we cover actually all of Council of Europe countries. And you can imagine that all our members, journalists, be they freelancers or staff members, are, if they are in the north and the south and the east or in the west, are very concerned at the moment for different reasons I will explore below, and you already mentioned them. But first, I think, and that's very important, they realize, and the public realizes alike, what an important job most of them have at the moment, reporting about a very complicated health issue which touches the whole earth at different levels. Juggling between scientists, advisors, and politicians' interpretations, putting into clear imperatives the health instructions by governments and regions. More than ever, we need professional journalists in the field. Journalism can save lives. Citizens are counting on them to report on the real impact of the pandemic, to disseminate protective measures, and to hold decision makers accountable. Journalists in most countries are recognized as so-called essential workers and journalism as a public good. But that, unfortunately, does not automatically transfer into a support package for journalism. Even though trust in journalism, especially in public service media, has significantly grown, their business models have not. So, you said it, Luciano, the first challenge is economic survival. With the background of an already failing market for journalism within the fragile media ecosystem in Europe, the crisis which preceded, we all know, the financial crisis in 2008, it has been accelerated tremendously with not yet known damage on Europe's media landscapes, and in particular on local journalism. Freelance journalists, especially those who cover sports and cultural events, have amazing losses from one day to the other. In some West European countries, they receive support from the governments. In others, they are left alone. The second challenge, because I'm sure my other speakers will talk about the economic survival in our sense, the second challenge is a sort of lockdown of press freedom throughout Europe. Unproportional emergency laws, we have all talked about Hungary, but also in Romania and Bulgaria and many of the Balkan countries, and I will not talk about the rest of the world, put press freedom and the rule of law greatly at risk. Media freedom these days are threatened, and I will count a few. The clampdown of unpatriotic reporting, meaning criticizing governments handling this unprecedented emergency situation, maybe not always as good as they would, is not really seen positively by many governments. Restrictions on travel and press passes, often no or very limited sort of press conferences, give the politicians, who are very happy about that, a way of using social media as their channel of communication. There are attacks on whistleblowers, there is increased surveillance, there is abuse of dis- and misinformation laws, and it comes to criminal prosecution and other coercive measures as a means of combating hate speech. So the situation is 5 to 12 for media and journalism. The irony or sadness is the crisis has shown the creative power of journalists and media all the many creative, informative, and powerful ways in which journalists and new media respond to the pandemic, and all the ways in which individuals, groups, and organizations are using not only digital, but mainly digital media to stay connected, to stay informed, and to be empowered, is amazing. And I think it's very important to note that. But the impact will be real and negative on the business of news. And as Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, the director of the Reuters Institute in Oxford, says, it will change our media landscapes in enduring ways of weakening many for-profit news media, killing of some, and perhaps strengthening a few. Rasmus already said in 2019, without funding, independent professional journalism will wither away. He also said, without a future for independent professional journalism, we risk leaving European democracy worse than we inherited. And for all these reasons, the EFJ had urgent meetings in these last 2 weeks with, and you said it at the beginning, with Commissioner Jourova, who is responsible for transparency and values and also for media pluralism, and with Commissioner Breton as part of a wider industry response and asking for an emergency fund for media. The EU and national media recovery plans, and this is what we put as concrete demands, demanded increasing national funding for public media. And I name a few others: direct financial support for daily and weekly newsrooms, direct emergency subsidies to fund newsroom jobs at commercial outlets specifically committed to local coverage, deferred or no interest business loans, tax credits on newsroom staff wages, household tax credits for paid subscriptions to local news, especially for the young, zero VAT, and some other subsidies, which should be distributed by an independent body, taking into consideration objective criteria. That, of course, is highly important. We propose EU and national news innovation funds to support new approaches to news gatherings, specifically, again, at local or community level. A new independent body, it could be called the EU Public Interest Media Endowment, would distribute grants to support independent community-based investigative journalism and new startups, among other innovations. These funds could be sustained through a tax on targeted online ads on online platforms. All these steps we discuss here, of course, do not represent a one-size-fits-all model. We know that subsidies for media would arguably be counterproductive and illegitimate in countries with low press freedom, high levels of corruption, and problems of media culture. But we hope they can command broad political support to create a more enabling environment for independent professional journalism during and specifically after the pandemic. Several European governments, including Denmark and Sweden, Austria, are taking relief measures to sustain the economy of the media sector. But most have not yet offered specific assistance to the media. Some countries, such as Croatia, have even deliberately refused specific media assistance. We believe this is not the time for states to take a restrictive approach to freedom of expression and information. We need, now more than ever, full transparency and open public discourse about the spread of the virus and the options to combat it. Professional journalism, transparency from those in power, media literacy, and the free flow of information are the best antidote to misinformation and conspiracy theories. And we know these are growing at a very high speed, and not only in the United States, not only by presidents, about the spread of COVID. Just, Luciano, to end up, maybe just a few examples from our national level, which I find quite interesting. For example, the National Union of Journalists in Great Britain, where the problem is specifically at local level very, very high, has unveiled a series of short and medium-term measures as part of its so-called news recovery plan. The proposals include a windfall tax of 6% on the tech giants, the establishment of a government-funded journalism foundation to invest in local news, the creation of a new asset of community value, and so on. Denmark, as so often, maybe is the best example. It has provided quite a bit of support It announced it will support private media which have lost between 30 and 50% of the revenues from ads. They will receive from 60 to 80% of what they lost as compensation from the state. In addition, a deal has been agreed with private media to encourage them not to dismiss their staff, which of course for the EFJ is very important. If they don't, the state will pay 75% of the salary. The employers will pay 25%. So that's Denmark. In Sweden, they also announced an increase of 200 million Swedish crowns for the media sector, justified by the fact that more money will be needed to support the industry in the future. Most of it is a special subsidy for media to expand their own media coverage. Our member in Sweden says it's not enough yet, but of course they welcome the support, which is more needed than ever. Also in Austria, the Austrian government has agreed a special media funding of 32 million euros to help the industry get through the crisis. Almost half of this goes to private commercial broadcasters. Daily newspapers will receive a total of 2.1 million and weekly newspapers 2.7 million euros. Our members criticized the circulation criteria and demanded that in addition to the number of copies, quality should be taken into account as a condition of funding. And I think I will stop here, but it opens a lot of debate also in terms of funding, who should get funding and by what criteria. This is all very important. But the most important thing that this is on the political agenda, both at national member state and within the European Union. Thank you, Lucian.
Renate, thanks to you for this very interesting first intervention. I'm not going to comment, and I will. I think we can leave all the questions for from our participants for later, unless there is one very pressing questions that our participants want to ask. I will now give the screen to Vincent Peyregne. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the World Association of Newspaper and News Publishers, WANIFRA. Before that, he was Head of Development at EdiPress in Switzerland, and senior advisor to the French Ministry of Culture and Communication.
Just a background about WANIFRA. WANIFRA is the World Association of News Publishers, so we represent about 3,000 companies in 120 countries. So my focus is not on Europe. Just a disclaimer also about the fact that we are not directly operating on media policy issues at the European level. I mean, this is the responsibility of our partner association members, and the ENPA and NME, just to name two of them. So my intervention today is more like personal views about what I believe could be partly the solutions based on my experience worldwide. So just to start, I think it's important to really look at the reality of the market. So WANIFRA operates in three main areas, and business sustainability is one of the most important things with media freedom elements of our portfolio of services to members. So I will start about talking a few minutes about the market trends worldwide, just to put this debate into perspective. I will not address immediate answers and responses to the COVID crisis. I'm seconding most of what Renate already said about the urgency and the needs to address these short-term issues and the survival of the press in Europe. Newspapers, news publishers worldwide, it's a market of something around $125, $130 billion worldwide, and the trends is diminishing. It's a downsizing trend for the past 10 years, average yearly -3%. What is interesting in that trend is the digital reader revenues are still increasing 11% a year. Digital advertising revenues are increasing by an average of 5%. These were figures for 2019. 2020 will look like much more gloomy, of course, due to the COVID crisis worldwide. What is interesting into these trends is that still 80% of our activities and what makes our living today and what makes the living of media professionals, including journalists, is print. Print represents still 80% of our activities. And we know that it's basically one of the biggest issue we have to face. I mean that the cultural shift into the digital world has not yet taken place. The tipping point for the global industry, and I think this is a very important historical landmark, has been 2015. So it's just 5 years ago that the global press realized that revenues, incomes, living resources comes more from reader revenues than advertising. That means that in 5 years' time, this industry, which is facing this major crisis today, needs to shift all the cultural elements of their companies. Media professional, journalists, salespeople, everybody, every organization needs to focus now on reader, serving readers instead of serving advertisers. I think this is one of the biggest challenge such an industry at that scale needs to address. So if we talk about solutions, and based again from our experience that Lucian, you briefly talked about our initiatives, we run hundreds of events, and it's even accelerating now with these obligations to go virtual, an average of 3 to 4 webinars a week. So we provide, most of our services is to provide really services to our members to help them transforming their organization. And what is the conclusions of 8 years working at Wanifra is that we are not really, I mean, we are facing an economic crisis, but it's not new. I mean, we've been talking about that for the past 20 years. And newspapers and media professionals themselves contribute to this economic problem. I mean, for decades, they view their job as delivering readers to advertisers. No, we need to deliver quality content and prioritize readers instead of advertisers. I mean, that's just the simple logic taken from the observation from the market. So we need, I think, and if there is something which would be meaningful midterm and long term, would be a cultural shock therapy at the European level. Most of the discussion comes around tax, subsidies, regulation, which are certainly very important, but I think subsidies is not enough to solve the problems. We need a strong regulatory framework. We need to preserve, and I will come back to this point in my fourth element. We need to secure the diversity, press freedom, and the rule of law in Europe, as well as in any other countries worldwide. But first of all, we need to change the cultural aspect of our companies. So if the EU would serve this industry, would preserve diversity, media freedom, access to information, is to preserve the long-term sustainability of this industry. And as well as we have initiatives in the cultural industries, especially in France. As you mentioned, Luciano, I work for the Ministry of Culture and Communication, and it's one of the very active public bodies in Europe supporting cultural industries. We need to really support anything that relates to changing the mindset. I mean, training, coaching. And it's not only consulting, it's really going deep into the transformation process of our organizations. The second element I would like to stress is again, back to the basic economic logic behind a sustainable environment for journalists and news organizations, is the access to capital. Where is the money? Who are the investors? The crisis is just accelerating the fact that SMBs, small-scale companies, freelancers do not have any more support because they don't have any access to capital to invest in new news organization. So one of the things, and again, it's not a silver bullet, but I'm really concerned about the consolidation of the market in the coming months and coming years. And I think we need to preserve, and one of the responsibility of a public body and any politician would be to preserve the diversity of news providers. I think without diverse information first, I mean, you don't serve the needs of the citizens, but also you drive the market. So news will be less relevant year after year. Diversity is very, very important for even the sustainability of the largest companies, and actually largest companies should certainly contribute to that. So one of the things we could talk about is where do we have an harmonized fiscal or tax framework to support foundations investing in news in Europe. And again, back to the French example, you may know that if there is a very dynamic market in terms of cultural industries in France, it's because there is a lot of tax benefits for people investing or companies investing in cultural assets. I think we should apply an harmonized perspective and a harmonized framework for investing in news outlets, and that I think would bring a lot of new capacities for these SMBs and independent publishers. The third element I would like to mention is to, again, it's back also to the cultural change. We really need to accelerate that. And I mean, we don't have time to go deep into that element of my suggestions because it's not just, again, education and training. It's really making sure that people can deliver performance-based program. How do we find the skilled media professionals? How do we encourage these people to join this industry? Many companies in our European members are actually facing a lack of capacity for them to invest in skilled people. Either they don't have the capacity to invest and to employ or to sustain their jobs, or they don't have any traction on the market because it's not attractive to work in a news organization. I mean, news organizations blaming themselves about the fact that it's a declining industry. Who wants to make a living and a life of working in a news organization? So I think investing in innovation, showing that, and that's a reality, that news organizations and news media professionals are innovating. And I could flag a lot of examples which are actually brilliant and could be an inspiration for the rest of the industry. I think we need a coordinated action plan to support innovation, both in terms of skills, how do you manage innovation in your organization, but also to access to new technologies and new tech entrepreneurs. Where do the tech entrepreneurs invest today? They do not invest for news organizations. They'd rather invest in other markets. So again, back to the economic logic around growth and performance and sustainability in our industry. And last but not least, that would be the fourth element. I think that's something that resonates among the citizens. So we have, like in Europe, we have values. We defend progressive values, democracy, open debate. 2 minutes, okay. And I would certainly close my remark with the reinforcements of the rule of law mechanism in Europe. Again, I'm not a policymaker at the European level. I'm just looking at that perspective from the citizen's perspective, but that makes logic that living in France, I will not accept that Hungary behaves with news organizations like they behave, or Poland. Why are they members of Europe? It doesn't make any sense for citizens, doesn't make any sense for the logic of Europe. So I think a stronger rule of law mechanism with sanctions mechanism, more civil society inclusion. I'm personally supporting this kind of strong statement from the European legal perspective. Thank you.
Vincent, thanks to you, because I think that only with the first two speakers, I've got three speakers, I've got a lot, sorry, two speakers, I've got a very long list of interesting points that we have been dealing with. And I'm sure that we will have even more after we hear from Christophe Leclerc. Christophe Leclerc is the chairman of Fondation Euractiv. He's the founder of the Euractiv Media Network. He's a former member of the high-level expert group on disinformation, and he is in the media sector from, correct me if I'm wrong, Christophe, now 30 or more than 30 years.
For coaching me and organizing large representative organizations, namely EFJ and OneIFRA. Fondation Euractiv is just a think-do tank, with a much smaller team, building on the experience of many stakeholders we interact with, and also on my own experience that you just reminded. Basically, I agree with everything that Renate and Vincent have said, and therefore it's disappointing from the point of view of a debate. In order to animate a little bit, I will try to be brief, very brief indeed, on the issues. And then regarding the solutions, building on what was just explained, I will try to be a little bit the devil's advocate and to say, in my view, where we are in the process and where we might be disappointed, namely having a lot of blah blah declarations and not enough decisions and not enough impact. And I'm sure the academics after me can take it up from there. Regarding the four issues, I would summarize. For indeed, first, we have the risk of one pillar of democracy vanishing. It was already fragile, and now it's even endangered in its very existence. I'm saying one of the pillars of democracy because, pointing to Beatrice with her own parliamentarian experience, it's another pillar of democracy which is not vanishing at all. It's well funded, but the parliaments are less effective right now than usual. And it's important that both pillars of democracy, there are others such as civil society, etc., are active, not only active, but also mutually supportive, because otherwise the executives will retain the special powers which they have now. Moving on. What we will have concretely from this summer is a lot of bankruptcies in this media sector. I want to be very blunt. I was a media entrepreneur. I've been a strategy consultant. I know what economics might be about. And the risk is that we will have the same situation as for the coronavirus crisis itself, which is that there were lots of warnings, and we have made them all together since 1 month. But there have not been many deaths yet. And therefore, people say, yes, we should take care of it. Yes, it's important, etc. But there is not much action yet. And you saw that the countries that acted early in the virus crisis, they are better off now. Unfortunately, there will be some resilience of the media sector, and the deaths, the bankruptcies, the fire sales, etc., will not come soon enough. And then we will have knee-jerk reactions, some ministers trying to organize some fast monies for this or that media, also with some political interference. I'm French and I know how this happens. Every time Le Monde is about to go bankrupt, then there is something to save it. And we could have the situation in a number of countries and also with worse solutions than what has happened in France. When we talk about press freedom, the risk of interference by governments, and also the role of oligarchs, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, we talk of economic matters, not only about press freedom, etc. It's because the media sector is so fragile that it is so cheap, that it is so easy to buy assets and then to try to influence the journalists and create all kinds of editorial and social issues. Two more issues. First of all, the slow speed of EU institutions and governments. Right now, there has been the processes that Renate explained, but the main talk is about horizontal measures, either across the whole economy with a little bit more for SMEs, etc., or across whole sectors. For example, the culture sector will probably get some help, but within that, we have special needs in the media sector. For example, there is a lot of talk about loan guarantees. But if a loan guarantee is not 100%, then it doesn't help, because very few banks would lend to the media sector right now, where the balance sheets are already very fragile. And in any way, even if the banks would lend because there is a guarantee at government or national level, then the loan has to be repaid. And next year, we will not have only the cost of this year, we will also have the cost of next year. So it's only postponing the problem. So what we need, and Vincent and Renate gave a lot of examples, which I will not list again. What we need is either reduction in costs, which can be tax, it can be part of the social costs, it can be other things, or extra revenues, that's the second point, extra revenues is obviously the best way, notably advertising, which is a very respectful way of financing the media sector. And it fits well because we have top readership right now. There is a huge need for public information, public communication, sorry, I used the wrong word, separate from the editorial information. And the third thing we need, it's a bit more complex, I'll not go into detail, is equity. There is basically not enough capital in this sector, and it cannot be loan capital, it has to be real equity. And here I'm talking mainly of the private sector, of course. The public sector has its own issues, and I understand why some want to talk about the financing of the public sector. I think, frankly, the issues are governance issues more than short-term economic in most cases. There are cases where it's also an issue. The last issue I want to mention before moving even more to solutions is the fragmentation of the media sector. I'm often asked to talk about the European media sector, and sometimes I answer, there is no European media sector. There are national media sectors, and then you have some niche media like Euractiv, but I don't confuse that with a media sector. It's surprising because we work with people who are very international minded, multilingual. The issues we cover are to some extent the same, but our sectors are very national. And this is while we face giants, Facebook and Google have not been mentioned very much yet, except from the tax angle. And they are super concentrated. Their representation is also super concentrated. EDIMA and then a few think tanks which are financed transparently or not. And on the other side, we are structured on a national basis. Our representation at the European level is not harmonious. It's a problem in itself. Yes, there are good initiatives. Yes, I should salute when people cooperate and talk to each other, but overall, we don't have a unified public affairs strategy. So in terms of solutions, I see four again. First, short-term aid. Others have addressed it. Two, I've already mentioned advertising, and one more that has been highlighted recently is subscription vouchers, because the media goes more into a paying mode, and that would be a way of helping to fight disinformation, helping media literacy, and respecting again the editorial independence. We'll see whether this comes true. I really hope so. We are pushing all in the same direction. It's not guaranteed. I'll come to that in a minute. But more importantly, beyond the short-term help, we need to rebalance the ecosystem. And the start of this EU mandate has been reasonably promising. The digital strategy is really good. Basically, we need to rebalance the ecosystem between the media, the advertising sector, and the platforms. The copyright directive, which has been a huge effort with little impact yet, was an important milestone, but there are many other aspects. I don't have time to go in details, except if the moderator wishes. It's notably about competition policy. It's not very much about writing new directives, which would take ages. It's about using the instruments which are already there. And then, yeah, as part of this rebalancing the ecosystem, it's important to note that the media action plan has been promised for the fourth quarter of this year. It has been promised, but sometimes it's forgotten. For example, it was not in the initial work program of the Commission, and Commissioner Breton forgot to mention it in its industrial strategy proposal. I was told it was a mistake, but still, it's an important mistake. Fortunately, it was not forgotten by everybody, notably not the digital strategy. And we have to push that it happens. I think it should happen this year and not be postponed like many other digital topics. The platforms are hugely influential these days. Commissioners have to beg them to do the right things on fighting fake news, and they are the same people lobbying to avoid regulation, which is not the best of positions. So we have to be very determined in pushing for such instruments to be on time or even earlier, given the crisis where we are. The third element of solution I would plead for is media innovation. Both Vincent and Renate have alluded to it. So I want to be short. A lot of things can be done at the national level. And indeed, cross-fertilization would be good. For example, France and Denmark are among the models, but that could inspire others. At the European level, there is a program called the Media Program, which, funnily, is not about media. It's about audiovisual. And it gives the impression that the European Commission does a lot on media. It doesn't. It does extremely little, actually. And therefore, a number of stakeholders are pushing for creation of a news program, which would be parallel to the media program and which would focus on media innovation, essentially. Plus the kind of things that Renato explained regarding funding for media, which goes beyond media innovation. Now, my last element, and I think I'm close to the time, is about stakeholder and EU involvement. I think basically, 1 minute, basically on both sides, we should coordinate better and relay our messages better at the national level. Between the media stakeholders, and again, I don't claim that Fondation Euractiv is a representative organization, but between the others, I think there could be a lot more cooperation. There have been top meetings, as Renato mentioned. There has not been a lot of coordination. There was some, and still that was a very discreet meeting. By the way, it's not even referred on the Commission website for the moment. There should be something a little bit broader with preparatory meetings so that we are indeed pushing in the right direction, not only for short-term help, but also for medium term. And finally, Luciano, the European Commission also needs to coordinate better. They have created a so-called project group of commissioners regarding media, which is good in principle, but it met only once, and that was in February. It was a short meeting with few outcomes, and several stakeholders have asked them to meet again, given the crisis where we are. We need to push for that because they each have interesting intentions, but it has not come to a plan. And the European Parliament can also play a very important role in this regard. I will put on the chat an op-ed which was co-signed by 42 MEPs. Sorry, Luciano, if I was a little bit over time, and back to you. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Christophe. We are perfectly on time, on the contrary, because so far the three speakers have been respecting the time allocated to them. I'm afraid it will be a very hard job for me to summarize this conversation before we start with the debate with the public and with the participants. So now it's up to Beatrice. Beatrice, I see that you are there. It's very, very difficult to summarize in a few lines all the things that you've been doing in your professional life. Basically, I will say just a few words. Beatrice Becerra was a member of the European Parliament for the legislature of 2014-2019, and there she was the vice chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament. Before that, correct me if I'm wrong, Beatrice, you have been a marketing and communication executive for 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years, I think, in multinational entertainment company such as CBS, Paramount, Universal, Disney, Sony, and Discovery Network. And I think since recently you became also an academic because you are enrolled in a research at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. But you are also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research.
Thank you very much, Luciano. It's for me a real pleasure to be here today, being part of this incredible. Excuse me if I maybe repeat some of the questions that have been already arising, but I would like to explain here what is my personal consideration of that, because I'm not a journalist. I have never been a journalist, but I write a lot. I have a huge presence on media. I have had for many years, and I have always been in touch with media because of my role in communication companies, you see. So for me, I think that the approach I have to European media is quite, let's say, transversal. say, because I have been on the private company, I have been also as a collaborator to media, and I have also been a legislator at the European Parliament. So getting into this situation we are living on the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, I think that one of the most perverse paradoxes of the pandemic is that today we need more and better information than ever, and we have more and better means at our disposal than ever to receive it. However, as the readership skyrockets, advertising disappears and media revenue plummets. And the right of citizens to truthful, free and rigorous information is more threatened than ever, precisely when it is most needed. So the media is more fragile than ever in its business model, and the future of journalists and workers is more uncertain than ever. You just have to see that even Pope Francis prayed for them a few weeks ago. So the COVID-19 pandemic has got the media still thinking about what business model they would adopt in the future. But there is no longer any room for deciding what they want to be in the next decade. It is now. And facing the situation requires at the same time waste, agility and prudence, because the coronavirus is exacerbating and easily accelerating many changes that were already underway. And the media and journalism are probably the best example, since a triple threat was already looming over them. Many of you have pointed this out, but I would like to resume in these three threats. The economic threat, as a result of the decrease in sales and advertising revenue, the threat to press freedom, spurred by authoritarian leaders and powerful tycoons eager to take advantage of the weakness and use the crisis to intensify the repression against independent journalists, and the third, the existential threat, how to find the audience and the resources to guarantee the survival and the sustainability of a journalism that proves to be necessary, useful, and up to date. So let me just have a little in-depth review of each one. The economic threat, we have been talking about it across this conversation, but it's of course the most pressing because it has to do with the survival of the media as companies with employees. And despite open newsstands, newspaper circulation has dropped by at least 25%. Local and regional newspapers are closing. News sites are at free because of the blacklist technology are preventing their companies to put their ads appearing in news about the coronavirus. And the more deaths incurred and the greater dependence on paper and advertising, the more danger for those media. Public aid to keep private-owned media afloat maybe for me be part of the solution, but it is directly connected to the second threat, the attacks on press freedom. The more digitized media with the most loyal and participatory audience will have a better chance to survive, as long as they have not built their business model around the click and do not depend on the financial support of foundations on big techs also. Looking at the threat to press freedom, it has to do with the fact that many states apply to the so-called shock doctrine, a concept coined by the Canadian Naomi Klein, journalist, you know it. And this refers to the exploitation of crisis by governments to cut rights or approve unpopular policies. From the closest Hungarian case, where Orban has imposed new restrictions with the excuse of fighting disinformation, to the increase in arrests of journalists by the Nicolás Maduro regime in Venezuela for reporting on coronavirus cases, or the criminalization that López Obrador in Mexico and Bolsonaro in Brazil, who have blamed journalists for exaggerating the impact of the pandemic. China has expelled foreign correspondents and tries to silence their internal critical voices. India has blocked the internet in regions of the country. Reporters have been detained or attacked in the Philippines, in Ivory Coast or Ukraine, but also in other countries, consolidated democracies. Accountability disappears. Press conferences are subjected to filters, or access to sources is prevented by the reason of exceptional circumstances. For instance, in Spain, a high proportion of citizens claim to have received false information from the government, in a 34%, from the media, 36%, or from politicians, 43%. These are the highest percentages in a recent study carried by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, which includes figures from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Argentina, and South Korea. And third, last but not least, of course, the existential threat. It has to do with the sustainability of journalism as an useful element, as an useful resource for citizens. Eduardo Suarez, who is journalist and director of communication at the aforementioned Reuters Institute, recalled yesterday what Walter Lippmann wrote almost a century ago in his classic The Public Opinion. And he said, "A body of readers who supports you in what good and bad is a power greater than the power that any advertiser can wield, and a power large enough to break an alliance of advertisers." And the internet is already our habitat, and nothing happens outside that informative and disinformative ecosystem. Along with this crisis, an express adaptations to teleworking has arrived. Face-to-face is no longer understood, and the physical conception of the newsrooms has passed to a better life. We have the figure that the collaborator is now generalized in media, video conference interviews, virtual press conferences, broadcasts from home. There are no time or distance restrictions now for journalism. And since the role of intermediation has been lost, both in politics and in the media, journalism has to be redefined. There are no unique solutions, of course, but I think that a comprehensive model change is required. I would say that I share Jarvis's position. It no longer has value as a product. It has to have a value added service configuration, a service that allows communities of citizens to engage in as Jarvis says, a respectful, informed, and productive conversation, and structured conversation. For me, it is not really about culture. It is more about consulting, advising, even coaching, I would say. And in my opinion, the press should empower experts as references. They have to become the shield of certainties against the pressures of those who seek to shape reality to suit them, and evaluate the decisions of the rulers and the veracity of their numbers. Okay. Press has to explain what we know and what we don't know about the pandemic and about everything else. But of course, press needs to, and this is my key point, needs to abandon the verification of news as their key task. It does not correspond to the media themselves. I think it's much more of related to distributors. It has been used as the main weapon against disinformation, but it does not work. It amplifies, consumes time, space, and resources, and it is not efficient. Therefore, it should not be funded, because in reality, the battle is not about data, it's about stories, and false data will never invalidate a good story. And for me, the EU media funding should be devoted to the industry itself, well-defined, well categorized as that. And this is my last point, this should be accompanied by an unequivocal demand for legislators to classify technology platforms as media, subject to the same level of legal and economic transparency transparency and accountability. This is for me the essential challenge for this Commission, taking advantage of the Conference of the Future of Europe and the integrated mandate of the Vice President Jourova on European democracy, and the role, of course, taking advantage of the role of the European Parliament to set the agenda of this conference. Of course, a new innovative search for sources of income needs to be urgently opened, adapted to the new consideration of the professional and the environment. But in short, let me say, in times of widespread uncertainty, with the consumption of information soaring and the political and economic obstacles to journalists and the media, the challenge that emerges is definitely confidence, reliability, trust. And this is the key to revalidate its character as a public utility service and to retain a demanding and faithful audience that feels part of a necessary club in defense of fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Beatriz. It's clear that you are really passionate and motivated in what you, and committed in what you are saying, and that you know this field very, very well. I will now give the screen to Alvaro. Alvaro is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration of the Free University of Amsterdam, the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. But Alvaro, I think that for the Open EU Debate Network, Jamone Network, I think he's one of the key initiators of this network. So I think that we all need to recognize his important role. Having said this, the interests of Alvaro are in the European public sphere, the role of civil society in the European Union policy making, populism and democracy in Europe. And I'm glad that you come as the last one, because I know your critical capacity, Alvaro. I'm sure that you will add something very interesting to the debate. 10 minutes, 12 minutes maximum, please. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Luciano. So that's it. So the four speakers were really great, and I will find it very difficult to complement in a successful way what they have said. I agree with most of what they have said, but I'll try to point out to a few structural issues that I think that the Corona crisis has exposed. The first, I think, is the lack of socialization of journalists with EU and global politics. By this meaning that most journalists work at the national level and they are socialized with national institutions. Now, in a context in which we are facing a global pandemic, how many journalists have been socialized with the World Health Organization or with the EU for that matter? So I think that there is a big challenge in making sure that global institutions, international institutions, are more widely covered at the national level. And if some potential solutions in that sense, I think maybe Luciano and Christophe can speak about it, but I think programs like Stars for Media, in which there's more exchange of journalists that go to other countries and so on, I think that definitely helps to encourage journalists to pay attention not only to what's happening at the national level, but also beyond. And I think this is particularly relevant beyond the pandemic, because we're also facing other issues such as climate change or tax evasion that cannot, that don't stop at the border, and national institutions are not well equipped to handle these issues. And therefore the involvement of international institutions and the involvement of national journalists with international institutions, I think is crucial. I think also something interesting that has revealed the Corona crisis is that national political leaders that often tend to speak to their national audiences, in this case, have also spoken to other national audiences. So we've seen Ursula von der Leyen appear in mainstream media in Spain or in Italy. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has also appeared in other countries' media. And I think this is a positive development that will encourage a little bit the Europeanization. Indeed, as we've mentioned in the first panel, the politicization, because political conflict over the EU becomes increasingly normalized. And I think this is a good thing. And this will probably encourage more national journalists to pay attention to beyond the nation state institutions. So this is a little bit the first challenge that that I think maybe was worth highlighting. The second, I think, is something that has already been mentioned, which is disinformation and the media business model. The nature of the media encourages them to publish more polemical information that might lead to the search of clicks, and the pandemic context doesn't really help. And in a context where citizens are fearful of the consequences, it's relatively easy to throw conspiracy theories into the information world, and that they thrive. And this is a problem. I don't have a magic formula for addressing this. I think definitely more investment in investigative journalism and in quality journalism, perhaps through subsidies, is something important. The strengthening of public media is very important. I'm not convinced about the strategy of fact-checking to address these issues, but it's possibly part as well of the solution, in combination with more quality journalism in general. And then I think the last point, and it's something that was partially touched by Christophe, I think that is very important to highlight, is media ownership structures and the power players that exist. So Google and Facebook are currently channeling all the advertising revenue that traditional media used to get 20 years ago. This transfer of revenue from the traditional media to these big platforms is posing a lot of fundamental questions about how the media works and how the media should. Maybe I say something that might be a little bit controversial. I recall that Vincent mentioned that now we're going towards a more reader-oriented media platforms. I think this is interesting, but at the same time, I also feel that this void that has left the dominance of Google and Facebook can also be taken advantage by several actors that want to invest in the media not as a business, but as a propaganda machine. So to put an example that might fit what is happening, and it is not exactly related to the media, but the connection will come slightly later. One of the Premier League football clubs, Newcastle United, is currently in talks of being bought by the Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. This is very controversial, and the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi, the former Washington Post journalist, issued a statement saying that she was against it because it was a way of improving the image of Saudi Arabia, using football to improve the image, right? And I think that with the media, there's also a similar trend. When Le Monde was mentioned before, is in a situation in which is economically vulnerable, it is prone to be taken by some actors that, well, maybe they will not make a profit out of owning Le Monde, but they might get some positive information or positive coverage. And I'm thinking as well of obviously Rupert Murdoch and the tabloid press, and it was not by chance that there was recently a front cover in The Sun in which the front cover was pubs shut until Christmas, and there was a small corner in the front cover where it says 596 dead, see page 4, which I think reveals a lot of problems that the current media ecosystem has. Another example can be the Chinese state-run company owning large shares of the Czech media, that also poses certain issues in regards to the coverage that they might give to China, or Amazon owner Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post. Again, it's very difficult to imagine a silver bullet to address this media concentration and media ownership issues, but I think possibly part of the solution is to break up the big technological players, Google and Facebook, in such a way that the advertising revenue can be better distributed across media platforms, so that these big technological companies don't ultimately end up having most of this revenue and dictating how the market functions. So a little bit, these are the three challenges and a few potential solutions that I came up with.
Thanks a lot, Alvaro. I think we can now start the debate. We have got some 20 minutes left before we go into our